Hello, good morning. Hope you can hear me. Today we are going to discuss the question on how senior men control the sexuality of their juniors in pre-colonial Africa. I had given out the audio, but there was need to also record a video on the same. And we are going to start with the introduction, where we are going to introduce what is sexuality. And sexuality is defined as a person's sexual orientation, which is who they are attracted to and how they express the attraction. A person can be heterosexual. This is being attracted to the opposite sex. Homosexual. This is being attracted to the same sex. And bisexual, which is being attracted to both sexes, or asexual, where one is unattracted to any sex. Sexuality is not limited to these terms, but they are common ones that people often use when describing their own sexuality. Due to the traditional way of doing things, we are going to base our argument while discussing this topic on heterosexual because it was only allowed form of sexuality in pre-colonial Africa. We are going to start our discussion and by giving the specific examples that the question had directed by identifying and discussing ways in which senior men control the sexuality of their juniors in pre-colonial Africa. In pre-colonial Africa, senior men controlled the sexuality of their juniors by forbidding them to marry and dictating who they could marry. For example, in Zulu culture, it was common for a man to be married to two wives at once. His first wife would be his senior wife, who was often older than him and had been married before. His second wife was typically younger than him and had never been married before. The senior wife was allowed to have children with her husband, but it was not considered appropriate for the junior wife to give birth until after the senior wife had produced an heir. In this way, the senior man could control both his own sexuality as well as that of his junior partners. This gave the husband control over his wife's sexuality as well as the ability to decide whether she could have children by another man. In pre-colonial Africa, senior men controlled the sexuality of their juniors. They did this by having significant control over women and also by having a high status in society. Women were often seen as property or as people who could be bought and sold, which meant that they were under the control of men. This meant that male elders were able to have power over female bodies. They could force them into marriages or sexual activities without their consent. The high status of older men also gave them power over young men. For example, if a young man wanted to marry a woman, he would need permission from her father. If he was unable to get the permission, he would be considered undesirable and unable to find a wife, which would greatly impact his social standing in society as well as his ability to reproduce successfully later on down the line. In pre-colonial Africa, senior men controlled the sexuality of their juniors in a variety of ways. This was the same case on the women in many African cultures. Women could not marry without the permission of their male guardians. This meant that any man who wanted to marry a woman had to have her father or brother or some other male relative agree to the marriage before he could even propose to her. The man was going to marry the woman would then approach her family with a proposal for marriage. If they agreed, they would arrange a date and time for the wedding ceremony. In addition, in many cultures, men had exclusive rights to polygamy. Polygamy, we can therefore define it as a system where one man has multiple wives. The practice was common in many African cultures before colonization, and it served to allow men to increase their power and wealth by marrying into multiple families. It also allowed them to have more children, which increased their genetic legacy and political strength. Polygamy was so important that some senior men would even marry younger girls who were not yet sexually mature. They could take multiple wives and use them for sex without fear of being punished by their own community or family members, even if they were already married. Let us take the example of Kikuyus and Luyas in Kenya. Men were allowed to marry as many wives as they could, may it be young or older one without being questioned. Mostly in Kenya, it was common for these men to marry young women when they were still very young. This practice helped ensure that there was a clear power imbalance between the two parties, and it also gave the man ownership over her sexuality until she reached puberty. This and engaging in polygamy allowed them to have multiple wives who could serve as mothers to their children, but also served as sexual partners. In this way, senior men had control over many aspects of junior women's lives. They could choose whether or not to marry them, where and when they could have sex with them, who would be a mother figure in their lives, and whether or not they would be able to have children of their own. In addition to polygamy, pre-colonial African society had other institutions that served to control the sexuality of their juniors by keeping them from having sexual relationships with people outside their social class or family. This included arranged marriages, which were often done at an early age, chastity belts for women, marriage rituals that were designed to keep couples from having sex until after marriage, and sometimes even death penalties for adultery. Finally, senior men could exert control over their juniors through physical force in pre-colonial Africa. If an elder man wanted a younger man's wife or daughter for himself, he might simply take her by force from her rightful husband or father without being questioned or without asking permission, because maybe the older man had a lot of wealth or he was well off in that society. Therefore, we can conclude that in pre-colonial Africa, it is only senior men who held absolute power over marriage issues or status issues or social issues, wherein we have confirmed that in pre-colonial Africa, men control both sexuality of their women and also sexuality of their junior men. Thank you.